The M2 MacBook Pro is a powerful tool for music production, but is it worth the high cost? And just how many upgrades to RAM, CPU, and hard drive do you really need? Well, I've been using my MacBook Pro for a little over a month now for all of my music production and video editing, and I've got some thoughts. Let's talk about it. So I've got some pretty big life changes on the way, namely the birth of my first child in a little over a month. My way of working in the studio is about to drastically change. With that in mind, I made the decision to rework my entire workflow, basing it around a portable setup using the MacBook Pro rather than my usual desktop setup of an iMac. So I opted to go for the M2 MacBook Pro, and today I'm gonna go over the setups that I envision using it for, why that's really only possible with a laptop, the exact specs of my M2, why I made those choices, and then I'll give some recommendations if you're looking to get one and are a little concerned with the price. We'll also talk about the connectivity because on first sight, it seems pretty limited with just 3 USBs. I'll also go over issues I've had in switching from an Intel Mac to the M2 chip. Finally, we'll do a fun little Diva test and open as many instances of Diva to see how many we can run on this CPU and with this RAM. If you're looking to get any new gear, like the stuff I'm using in this video, I have links in the description. It helps the channel a ton, but let's talk about it. So I made the decision to buy a laptop, mainly this MacBook, because I envisioned 3 very different use cases for the laptop compared to the iMac. And the first use case is the obvious and the standard setup of just connecting to everything in this studio. So MIDI, which is sending information to all of these synths, audio sending back to an audio interface, all of that connected to the laptop, and then of course mixing in the laptop and then video editing. Now that can all be done with the iMac that I currently have, but this is of course faster and more powerful, and believe me, that is a welcome addition. The second use case was for a live streaming setup, and this is very similar to the full setup, but it's a little more focused on the DAWless desk with the added complications of streaming using the phone as a camera, which connects to Streamlabs on the computer. The camera is my iPhone, and then audio is coming through the DAW. It's a complicated routing, but I say all of this because that requires a lot of power, and the M2 definitely delivers on that front. So I can have multiple channels in my DAW, which is sending MIDI, and receiving audio from the DAWless desk. And then from there, I can have tons of effects on each of those individual tracks. And if you want to see more about this setup, check out this video talking about my hybrid DAWless setup. When I was making that video with my old computer, I was running into issues between needing the power to stream, but also needing effects on the audio tracks and things like that. And the M2 solved all of that. So that's my second use case. The third use case, and this is really where the laptop and the M2 MacBook shine, because I can take this powerhouse of a laptop anywhere. I can be in the house, or I could connect a MIDI keyboard and have MIDI so I can make music and perform still. My favorite setup so far is just having the SP404 connected via USB-C into the M2 MacBook. And that's all you need, just the SP404, the USB-C cable, which is sending audio. It can send MIDI, and it also powers the SP404, all with just a single cable. Or you could work with the audio and treat the SP404 as an audio interface, but also an external effects box. So you could do live effects to a song on the fly. Okay, so here's my 2023 14-inch MacBook Pro. It's got the M2 Pro chip, the stock one. It's got 32 gigs of RAM and a 1 terabyte hard drive. Now, I made a few concessions due to budget, and I want to talk about those really quick. I would have preferred to go for 64 gigs of RAM. Might be a little overkill, but I do a lot when it comes to commission work with a ton of sample libraries, MIDI, and lots of audio files and plugins. So having a lot of RAM is helpful. I haven't had any issues with the 32 gigs, but I would have liked to have that little bit of wiggle room or a buffer having more RAM. But RAM costs a lot, so I made the decision to go with the 32 gig, and as I mentioned, Even with my biggest projects, like one I did a couple months ago, there were 80, 100 tracks. I did it on that and I had no issues. CPU wise, the M2 Pro works incredibly well, so I didn't upgrade much. I watched a lot of videos about the M2s and I felt like with the stock one, I could get a lot done, so that's what I went with. 1 terabyte hard drive. When it comes to music, but also video editing, it actually gets filled up pretty quickly. I think stock it's 512, which is just ridiculous to offer that on a computer that costs so much, but that's what they offer, so I upgraded to 1 terabyte. I would have preferred to, but when I do video editing, I use an external SSD, and so that kind of mitigates the issue, but it still would have been nice to have that. But these things just add up in price when you start doing it with Apple, and so I made the decision to go external hard drive for video editing with a solid state drive. Make sure it's an SSD if you're doing that. In terms of audio work for my music, I keep it all in the internal hard drive, and there's not really been an issue with that. So you can get away with the 1 terabyte for sure. And if you're not working with a lot of audio, if you do a lot of MIDI and things like that, you might even be able to go with the 512 or whatever size that one is. I wouldn't advise it, but it is there if you're trying to cut costs. If you're working with a lot of audio, sample libraries, and effects in a DAW, you'll definitely want a lot of RAM. If doing a lot with DAWless and just using your computer to really just record and maybe add small bits of effects to a 2-track stereo file or 4 or 5 tracks that are all audio, you may not need a MacBook Pro. You might be able to go with a MacBook Air or something like that, or consider Windows, but I'm not the biggest fan of the interface of Windows, so that's why I'm stuck in the hellish landscape of Apple prices. But these are all things to consider for you, and if you have any questions, let me know in the comments. Okay, so one other thing to consider is connectivity. You get 3 USB-C ports and an SD card slot. It's not amazing, but USB-C is pretty versatile and very fast, so there are some decent workarounds. I used an Anker USB-C hub that adds a few additional USB-C ports, and I'll put a link in the description. From that, I even connected another hub into it, and surprisingly, the latency is not bad at all, and it's totally functional. So the key to making it work is put primary connections like an audio interface or sampler directly into the laptop, or just that first USB-C hub. Additional connections like a microphone and MIDI hubs would then go into the second. This is by no means ideal, but I think it's here, connectivity, where the portability concessions really come into play. So if you need more connections and don't need a laptop, an iMac or Mac Mini will definitely get you more there. That being said, with USB-C, you can use something like an SP404 as your audio interface, MIDI through, and sampler. So that could potentially bring 3 cables down to just a single one. So for example, I only have 1 cable going into the MacBook Pro, and it's that USB-C Anker MIDI hub. And with that, I've got power going into the hub, which is then powering the laptop. You can see up here that it is charging. Then I've also got a cable sending MIDI to this Arturia Mini Lab, and I've also got the audio interface plugged in, and I mean, there's minimal latency. So then if you needed more, you can either connect into the computer, we're only using 1 of the 3, or you could add another hub to this USB-C hub and go from there. M2 has definitely increased efficiency in my workflow with its speed and power, but I did run into some issues with it, especially when I was moving things over from my previous workflow. And I want to talk about 2 specifically because I think they're very interesting to note. The first one, and this is the biggest issue, was when I was moving all of my projects from the Intel iMac into the M2 MacBook Pro. All the files would move over perfectly, and when I'd open them, they'd be preserved just as they were on the iMac. The issue came when I would open files that I had been creating strictly on the M2. And best example I can give you was I was working on a commission track that was due the very next day, and I had made the whole song on my M2, and it was a reference to a previous project I had worked on my 2020 iMac, and so I needed to get some reference ideas and some of the plugins. So I opened the 2020 project, grabbed some of the stuff, opened the new project back up, and all of the plugins that I had went to the stock presets. Even if I had saved my presets that I had made, let's say a compressor that was doing 25 threshold and a 4:1 ratio, it had changed to the stock preset. So that was a very strange occurrence. I'm not sure why that was. If anybody knows, let me know in the comments. But I just wanted to mention that, so make sure you have everything saved. I don't know if that's an issue with these new silicone chips. I remember when they were first released, there was a lot of issues with the OS. Just something to keep in mind, make sure you have backups. I didn't in that instance, so I had to go back and fix everything manually and on the fly, and it was a nightmare, but I got it working. That song's in the description if you want to check it out. And the second issue that I ran into had to do with live sets, and I think this is more of an issue with Logic itself, but I had done this before on a previous computer and never had issues. But I did a live set using Logic as the brain, sending MIDI, receiving audio, adding effects to the audio, and also sequencing everything. So there was a timeline with different time signatures, different BPMs, and they would be changing. And I noticed that after I would record, the guitar audio would be time shifted all over the place. And I have a feeling this was partly due to all of the time changes. But what I discovered, one workaround, was the more times I would record in a audio tracks folder. So every time you record in Logic, if you're recording on a specific audio track, it makes a folder of all those different takes, and you can choose between those takes as you want. But I would notice about after 3 or 4 takes, once I would record additional takes, that's when it would start getting all off on the time sync. So what I did was just delete all those takes or make separate saves with each take and then go from there. Very individual and probably more of an issue on the user, me, but it is there. It's something to consider. Logic isn't really built for that, and I think it was more of an issue with Logic than it was with the computer, but it's just something to consider. The bigger issue was, of course, this migration from the iMac to the MacBook and those weird preset shifts and things like that. So just a few issues. I wanted to give a heads up. Again, I'm not sure how many would even run into any of these problems, but they are there. They are stuff I ran into, so I just wanted to talk about them a little bit. Okay, so now it's time to do the Diva test. So I have one patch already loaded up, the Poly 6, and then we'll start stacking layer upon layer. Now, bear in mind, I am using Streamlabs and recording this, so that may have some effect on the RAM and CPU, but we'll still see what we can get. So we'll turn this on. I'm going to lower it quite drastically. All right, let's copy it. There it is. All right, so we hit system overload. Let's see how many we made. So we made 54 instances of Diva before the CPU did not enjoy it. We've got the buffer size on 64, which definitely has an impact. If it were higher, we could crank out a lot more. If we put buffer size to 128 or 256, we could probably get 70 to 100 instances of Diva. But here with it on 64, we got 50, which is still quite a lot of Diva. So as I've mentioned before, I've never run into any issues with hitting the CPU max, so it's nice to see. But there it is, 54 instances. Lastly, I just want to give a little bit of my opinion on this computer after a month of heavy usage for music production, video editing, and even podcast editing. It's pricey. I mean, there's no way around that. I had to budget accordingly because of that, and basically was considering that I'm future-proofing my studio and also giving myself the ability to work outside of the studio when I have to be inside the house. I'll always have the option that I can work wherever I am. If this computer, the MacBook Pro, is way more powerful than the iMac that I have. Still 32 gigs of RAM, but the CPU is completely different. Everything is faster. Working on video editing used to feel like I was fighting the computer every time I made an edit on that iMac. But on this, it's a breeze. It exports probably 3 times faster, and that's just a guess. I'm not giving an accurate number, but it exports video and audio far faster than the iMac ever did. And that has really increased my efficiency. Because of that, it's just been a lot easier, and I'm not getting frustrated every 5 seconds when I'm working on something. USB-C has also become a massive part of my workflow. And yeah, there was USB-C on the iMac, but I never really used it. I just wasn't into it. I never thought of it because I had all of the older USB-C 2 connections on there. But with the MacBook, there's only USB-C, so I had to sink or swim. And what it made me realize is how versatile and powerful C is. So I have some videos on the channel where I'm playing the SP404 and I'm sending MIDI and power into the SP404 with just the USB-C cable. And still with that same cable, audio is being sent out of the SP back into the computer. So we've got audio, MIDI, and power all within a single cable. The other really cool thing is I can connect the USB-C hub into the computer. This computer is being powered right now. It's charging. It's also with that one cable and that one hub sending MIDI, receiving MIDI, connecting to a camera, all kinds of stuff. So there's a lot you can do with a single cable with USB-C, and that's completely changed my workflow. So yeah, it's pricey, but if it's within your budget or if there's another MacBook that you're looking at that has similar things, I hope this video helped you. And if you have any questions, let me know. But that's all I've got for today. If you're looking for some merch, I've got this new Solar Expeditions shirt on my Bandcamp page. The link is in the description. It helps the channel a ton. If you got some value out of the video, leave a like, subscribe if you haven't. It all helps. Just hanging out is more than enough. So until next time, thanks for watching.